with this. So you'll hear this a lot when you go to Platypus events, and it's just kind of establishing very quickly like what we're actually here to do. So I'll start with this. Platypus is a project for the self-criticism, self-education, and ultimately the practical reconstitution of a Marxian left. At present, the Marxist left appears as a historical ruin. The received wisdom of today dictates that past failed attempts at emancipation stand not as moments full of potential yet to be redeemed, but rather as what was. Utopianism that was bound to end in tragedy. As critical inheritors of a vanquished tradition, Platypus contends that, after the failure of the 1960s New Left, and the dismantlement of the welfare state and the destruction of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and 90s, the present disorientation of the left means we can hardly claim to know the tasks and goals of social emancipation better than the utopians of the past did. So I'll kind of continue on from there, and also it's in these founding documents, from a article called "The Left is Dead, Long Live the Left." And that's our slogan, right? And it kind of goes into why that slogan is. And this will kind of lead into what I'm kind of covering up to deliver today. So, according to Lenin, the greatest contribution of the German Marxist radical Rosa Luxemburg to the fight for socialism was the statement that her Social Democratic Party of Germany had become a stinking corpse as a result of voting for war credits on August the 4th, 1914. Lenin wrote this about Luxemburg in 1922, at the close of the period of war, revolution, counter-revolution, and reaction in which Luxemburg was murdered. Lenin remarked, she was murdered by her own party, by the way, by the SPD. Actually, at that point, it wasn't her party, but anyways. Lenin remarked that Luxemburg would be remembered well for her incisive critique at a crucial moment of crisis in the movement to which she had dedicated and ultimately gave her life. Instead, ironically, Luxemburg has been remembered for her occasional criticisms of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Two lessons can be drawn from this history: that the left suffers as a result of the accumulated wreckage of intervening defeats and failures, from a very partial and distorted memory of its own history. The other phrase that we use to refer to this is ideological obstacles, right? So it's this feeling that the present understands itself through history, but that history comes up in a kind of frustrated and kind of objectified, or what we call reified way. And actually that in trying to not poke holes, but to really understand, like, okay, why is it that when we, for example, hear the left talk about Palestine and Palestinian sovereignty, they bring up Lenin and anti-imperialism. Like, actually, what does that mean? And what is it about bringing up Lenin in that way that actually prevents you from thinking about the left clearly, or even about the death of the left? And that at crucial moments, the best work on the left is its own critique, motivated by the attempt to escape this history and its outcomes. At certain times, the most necessary contribution one can make is to declare that the left is dead. So I'm going to now kind of do a bit of an overview of how we might start looking at the history of the left, kind of from this, what we'd call a left-centric view of history, so looking at the most critical aspects of the left criticizing itself, right? So we'll go here. So the first half of the syllabus, I've kind of nutshelling in a bit, so this is when we go over kind of Marx and Engels. And this is, the subtitle is The Ruthless Critique of Everything, Capitalism as the Crisis of Bourgeois Society, Bonapartism and the Dictatorship of the Proletariat. So when I was preparing to lead the reading group for the first time, I asked, actually Ephraim here at the time, what points that I should emphasize while doing the reading group. And he replied, the lessons of 1848. It is the lessons of 1848 which differentiated Marx from other socialists of his time, and indeed what differentiated the revolutionary Marxists from socialist reformists, trade unionists, and anarchist terrorists of their time. We learned in the first half of the syllabus that in the political upheavals of 1848, and the emergence of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie as politically opposed classes, Marx saw not a war of oppressor versus oppressed, but two sides of the same crisis of liberalism. In the crisis of value generated by industrial capitalism, both classes were trying to stake a claim on the bourgeois right of labor. Where 19th century workers' organizations campaigned for their right to decide how their labor will be sold, owners of capital fought to maintain their rights as purchasers of labor. Both were trying to reproduce liberal society in its crisis, but in doing so, regressed into pre-bourgeois forms or pre-liberal forms of social struggle. In other words, the strike action, protests, police repression, revolutionary violence would all be forms of social interaction that Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, and Benjamin Constant would have predicted would have said would be an obsolete way of taking charge of a rational modern society. The socialist revolutions of 1848 failed and marked the emergence of what Marx called Bonapartism, the historical condition in which the bourgeoisie could no longer, and the proletariat not yet, rule politically the modern society or the modern state of capitalism. Instead, the powers of the bourgeois state were to rise above society in an attempt to save it from its own crisis, reducing civil society to competing political rackets. And again, just like throw your questions at me, kind of just remember what you're going to say, and then we'll talk about it at the end. So to quote Marx, there is therefore an antinomy, right against right, both equally bearing the seal of the law of exchanges. Between equal rights, force decides. But the force of the Bonapartist state upholds a bourgeois consciousness which cannot hope to transcend beyond the social form that keeps society in crisis. But it is precisely this crisis that presents a political opportunity that, if taken up consciously, may prove possible the realization and going beyond bourgeois society. It is this need for conscious and critical struggle for power towards self-abolition that leads Marx into arguing for the necessity of an organized political party towards the ends of establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. For it is in a mass party that the crisis in society may be objectified and understood, to capture the social being of capitalism within the party membership. And it would be this understanding and social power that would prepare them to take control of capitalist society consciously. The dictatorship of the proletariat would need to be a better dictatorship than Bonapartism, a dictator for the majority of society aimed toward the abolition of politics altogether. So going into the second half of the reading group, we actually look at some writings from the 1960s. So it is here where we turn to the readings by Karl Korsch, J.P. Nettle, Cliff Slaughter, and the Spartacist Leagues, Lenin and the Vanguard Party. And these writings kind of confront us in the dramatic stage of the crisis of the Second International. We've made a leap of a few decades from Marx's time into a period where not only a mass international socialist party exists, but has its own history and has come into crisis, where its political direction becomes unclear to itself and its critical sensibility obscured. It must be noted here that this collection of readings are not written by the contemporaries of Lenin, Luxemburg, or Trotsky, but rather taken from the area of the New Left in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We should think about how the left at this time found themselves confronting a similar question of the direction and necessity of political leadership in the crisis of its sway on the world political stage, as well as the further degeneration of politics during the Cold War, and how the phantoms of the early 20th century revolutionary Marxists were raised back from their graves and interrogated. The exception of this author's is Korsch's essay, Marx and Philosophy, or is it Marxism and Philosophy? Marxism and Philosophy, written in 1923, a few years after the success of the Russian Revolution and the defeat of the German Revolution. Here you get the impression that it is written by a man determined to learn from the long second half of the 19th century, a time when the retreat from revolutionary fervor led into the transformation of Marxism from a critical dialectical system of understanding the world into a objective, so this is a quote, an objective approach to economics, politics, ideology, etc. Quote, thus the materialist conception of history eventually became something quite undialectical in their epigenies. But what did this actually mean for the direction of the Socialist Party? So going back to Lenin and Luxemburg and their return to what was called orthodox Marxism and the Marxist writings from the 1848 revolutions. As the 20th century rolls around, the German Social Democratic Party has grown into an organized force in society with incredible influence, sometimes characterized as a state within a state. But in abandoning its critical ends for the self-abolition of the working class, the SPD began to affirm changes in capitalism of their time as movements towards socialism. Thus, it actually signified a regression in the struggle towards socialism, even though the party was expanding. It is in Luxemburg's Reform or Revolution pamphlet that reformism is taken up symptomatically, that is, as a new phenomena of capitalism, and the stakes of this development are clarified. For what would be the point of the SPD if capitalism was doing the work of social transformation for them? If the movement is everything and the ends are nothing? And to quote Luxemburg, it is not true that socialism will rise automatically from the daily struggle of the working class. Socialism will be the consequence of 1, the growing contradictions of capitalist economy, and 2, of the comprehension by the working class of the unavoidability of the suppression of these contradictions through social transformation. When, in the manner of revisionism, the first condition is denied and the second rejected, the labor movement finds itself reduced to a simple cooperative and reformist movement. We move here in a straight line towards the total abandonment of the class viewpoint. J.P. Nettle, even as a liberal academic, so he's working in the 20th century, he's a biographer of Rosa Luxemburg and a historian of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. So J.P. Nettle picks up on Luxemburg's and her left-wing comrades' strange and orthodox return to Marx. The lessons of 1848, that the Workers' Party must develop the capacity to take responsibility for the direction of the capitalist state and work through its contradictions consciously, taken at that time to be old-fashioned and archaic, suddenly became the crucial question to the survival of the Socialist Party. Lenin's "What is to be done" strikes a startlingly similar tone. Taking up the rise in trade union economism that was humbly bowing before the experience of the class at the point of production, and on the other side, anarchist terrorism, Lenin picked up a similar crisis in party leadership, where once again, the current of capitalism, the industrialization of Russia, was assumed to be accelerating liberalization and democracy. Like Luxemburg, Lenin's orientation to the economists and anarchists allowed him to perceive them as phenomena which could actually be transcended. I will say here that it is one of the great advantages of the Platypus syllabus that we can read Luxemburg and Lenin so closely to each other. Not only to see the generalized form of crisis splitting through the Second International, which again isn't just Germany, but all over Europe, Eastern Europe, in the Americas, and a couple of other countries. But in reading them together, we can also see the clear influence and collaboration between Lenin and Luxemburg, when today they are so often pitted against each other. It may have been the case that the growth of the Second International would always mean that its socialist parties would begin to be part of the problem of capitalism, by nature of the proletariat being a phenomena that reproduces capitalism. But as Cliff Slaughter clarifies, the whole point is to have the leadership in place to be able to clarify and become conscious of the state of affairs, to consciously master it towards becoming the decisive force in history. Seeing that this may be a crucial point in the development of the Socialist Party, Lenin and Luxemburg not only advocated for, but attempted to take up the responsibility to provide the revolutionary leadership befitting of a revolutionary socialist party. The New Left Spartacist League's pamphlet, Lenin and the Vanguard Party, provides an insight into what the struggle for revolutionary leadership in the Russian Social Democratic Party entailed. There's this idea that, quote, with respect to the Vanguard Party, the history of the Marxist movement appears paradoxical. Like Marx, Lenin's attempts to preserve the, quote, vanguard role of social democracy meant his positions appeared inconsistent, inflammatory, and counterproductive. But by 1905, it became apparent that his actions to, quote, separate the revolutionary socialists from the reformists had paid off in the Bolsheviks' subsequent ability to lead and accelerate revolutionary struggle and grow the Revolutionary Party center. Reflections on the 1905 Russian Revolution and Luxembourg's The Mass Strike and Trotsky's Results and Prospects give the impression of a world suddenly caught in the fire of revolutionary potential. A moment when the primitive form of strike organization is turned into advanced action through the leadership of the Russian Social Democratic Party and the Second International, becoming a moment of world historic importance that developed the movement and culture of the worldwide working class. It is also from here that our readings, beginning with Trotsky's Results and Prospects and carried on into the State and Revolution, and Luxembourg's writings for the German revolutionaries, start to turn more explicitly to Marx, Engels, in 1848. The concept of permanent revolution, which emerges, this is Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution, which emerges from the 1905 moment, becomes a way of getting at the failure of bourgeois democratic revolutions since 1848. So democratic or like maybe republican revolutions is maybe something you've heard a bit more recently, to lead into the dictatorship of the proletariat. The limited successes of the Bolshevik Party in 1905 thus reaffirmed Marx's point of the necessity of the conscious proletariat party to lead a revolution, both for democracy but also for the abolition of bourgeois democracy. You'll probably hear this phrase, the battle, what was it? The battle for democracy but not of democracy? The battle of democracy, right, rather than for. The point being that actually democracy is kind of a production of the capitalist state. It's a way for the capitalist state to kind of like coordinate, or not coordinate, but to, coordinate competing interest groups for the overall preservation of the capitalist form of production. That might be a bit vulgar, but maybe this question of democracy can come up. Okay. We must also consider the Spartacus League's argument that the refinement of the revolutionary leadership of the Russian Social Democratic Party allowed for its necessary but tragic escape from an increasingly opportunist and chauvinist Second International. There is a moment in Marguerite von Trotta's biopic of Rosa Luxemburg where, returning from a convention of the Second International, she realizes that despite the talk against the war, the party is wholly unprepared to take the revolutionary responsibility necessary to avoid the war. I found myself being deeply shocked by this. It's a great movie, by the way, but you really feel it, right? And I wondered how Marxists and socialists in the party, particularly outside of the orbit of the SPD, would have felt seeing their comrades become ensnared in the devastating slaughter of the world's working men. It is here that Lenin's Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, becomes a moment to pause and take stock of the story we've been following of the Second International. We think back to the economists and revisionists and take them up as symptoms of developments in capitalism, the emergence of monopoly capitalism and imperialism, and subsequent formation of a labor aristocracy, that is, the trade union leaders associated with the socialist parties, that had become the, quote, agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class movement. Petit bourgeois elements that found a war a necessary evil for the preservation rather than the emancipation of the national proletariat, and thus the preservation of capital. Lenin and Trotsky's wager was that imperialism was, quote, the eve of the world's socialist revolution, that the formation of an international proletariat connected through monopoly, technology, and socialization and concentration would quickly take up the revolutionary call of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and complete the world revolution. And now we're going into kind of the last part of what we cover in the reading group, which is going into the Frankfurt School. And also the kind of importance of Trotsky and kind of preserving this moment of failure, right? Failure of world revolution. It is here that actually the syllabus took a characteristically platypus turn towards Trotsky and the Frankfurt School. So one's the duck and one's the otter, or beaver, it's a beaver. And it is a controversial turn. Nothing less for taking stock of the historical defeat of Marxism. Following the failure of the German Socialist Revolution, the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg, and the subsequent isolation of the communist Bolsheviks, the retreat from revolution didn't simply mean a halt in the progress of the Socialist Party, but rather a startling regression. Lenin's left-wing communism and infantile disorder, Trotsky's Lessons of October, and Lukács's The Standpoint of the Proletariat all confront the problem of a seemingly immediate confusion, aversion, and reification of the history of the Bolshevik Party. The dynamic, critical method of the Bolshevik Party leadership very quickly becomes a set of hard and fast rules in the eyes of young socialist movements around the world. In Lenin and Trotsky, we see the last attempt to maintain the political forms, quote, so referring to Trotsky's transitional program, that would be able to mediate history with the ambitions of the present. But perhaps it was Lukács's attempt to preserve a critical position ideologically, even though this was insufficient to the task of actually changing the world, that proved to be more successful, at least in the way it informed the development of the Frankfurt School's critical theory. But we must not forget that they are equally influenced by the lessons of 1917. And here I said, it's just a note to myself, it's interesting to think of Lukács's turn to Marx's writings in Das Kapital as a return to the long second half of the 19th century, the sudden loss of revolutionary opportunity and political retreat. When reading the works of Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky, particularly around the 1905, 1917, and 1918 revolutions, I couldn't help but feel as if I was reading a kind of science fiction. A world where suddenly everything became possible, where the masses of working people caught a glimpse into the true potential of our world, and were working their way into becoming the midwife of a radical new world. By contrast, Horkheimer, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, and Theodor Adorno feel painfully familiar. The 1930s, 40s, and 50s seem infinitely closer to 2026 than 1917, for they are registering the beginning of the death of the left. The extinction and fossilization of the Revolutionary Communist Party, which all the while refuses to rest, not even the dead are safe. Because despite it all, history continues to take us with the realization of a free society, to task us, with the realization of a free society, with the possibility of redeeming not just the history of capitalism, but of all human suffering. Hegel has this image of the slaughter bench of history, right, as a kind of redemptive possibility of progress in history. The question remains, how do we maintain a critical sensibility towards revolutionary ends in the face of not only the defeat of Marxism, but its continual decay and exploration? Perhaps this question was clearer in the Cold War, when the reified and obscured history of the revolutionaries was objectified in the official Marxism of the USSR, and thus may be a bit easier to demystify. Now our object of critique is arguably more elusive. The New Left's attempt to break from the history of Marxism resulted in not the learning of mistakes, but the repetition of mistakes unconsciously. Perhaps in a similar way to the Second International's unlearning of the lessons of 1848. A continual crisis from bourgeois society becomes, if not predictable, recognizable. From Adorno, quote, "The law that, according to the Hegelian dialectic, governs the restlessly destructive unfolding of the ever-new consists in the fact that at every moment the ever-new is also the old lying close at hand. The new does not add itself to the old, but remains the old in distress in its hour of need." And although the idea of the old repeating itself over and over again may sound like a hellscape, Adorno is actually being optimistic. At least we have a point of reference that we can begin from. Maybe the first step to reconstituting the revolutionary political leadership needed for any transformation of society is to learn the lessons of 1848 and 1917, and how these old lessons become distressed in the present. To continue with the ruthless critique of everything, including the left in its history, fearless of where the critical thread will lead us. So that's the end. That's the end of it. I'm just going to leave it there. So I recognize that there's tons there. It was actually a lot more kind of dense than I thought it was. So we'll do a Q&A. Also, if you just want to ask questions more about what Platypus is, or anything.
And we're going to link link it to Kautsky.
And we're gonna, maybe if someone really wants to talk about Kautsky, we can bring him up. I guess just as maybe I'll just like pitch it on here. So one of the more novel things that Platypus has, in addition to its kind of approach to thinking about history in the present, is that we have a record of the last 20 years of the left. So we kind of started out as a nucleus of like professors and students in 2006 at the kind of in Chicago, so across the University of Chicago and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, that were kind of coming out of the anti-war movement. A bunch of students had kind of approached this one professor in particular, Chris Cutrone, one of our founding members, and he kind of put together a reading group. And in 2000, by 2006, this had, well actually I'm trying to remember, what, our first panel was 2009? I'm trying to remember what, 2007. So I think we became like a Platypus reading group, Platypus, like the Platypus Journal, or what's now called the Platypus Review. And then in 2007, we became like an affiliated society. So this is when we, and actually it might have been, we founded it in 2006 to then have the panel in 2007. So as a society, we kind of host the conversation on the left, right? And we kind of founded ourselves as a ostensible organization so that we could actually have a role in bringing the left into conversation with ourselves. Why was I talking about this? I had a point to this.
You were going to say something about the Kautsky question by addressing the history that Platypus records.
Yeah, so as part of, one of our main functions as an organization is to host the conversation, to bring out these kind of what I call ideological obstacles, right? So the way that history is kind of being repeated consciously or unconsciously in the activity of the left. We hosted these events. We have the Platypus Review, so you can have a really messy example of it here. So we publish this monthly. I don't know if, Tony, you have any copies of
3 or 4, yeah.
3 or 4, okay. We'll go try to get some more up to you. But these are free, so you can just take them when Tony's got them available. It's also on the website, all for free. But that is like another way that we host the left. So the PR's purpose is to kind of curate these submissions from the left as a way to keep track of the left in history in our own lifetime. So as a result, in the last 20 years, we've kind of, we kind of have a story or a kind of narration of what the left has been doing in the last 20 years, and particularly something that we call like the millennial left. So vaguely, we kind of categorize it as existing from kind of 2004, 2002 with the anti-Iraq movement up into 2015, where a kind of more utopian and maybe, to put it a bit more vulgar, like a bit more interesting and kind of like higher vision left then collapsed into becoming the campaigners for like the Labour Party under Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party. And actually a big part of this, what we'd call the death of the millennial left, or a way that we can kind of track it, is the way that they discover Kautsky through a kind of network of, there's a few publications, maybe the most famous one being, it's called Revolutionary Strategy by a guy called Mike McNair, which was kind of exported to the US and adopted by the founder of Jacobin magazine, Bhaskar Sankara, who then kind of presented this idea of like the mass socialist party back to the DSA. And that kind of then became a idea of like, okay, well, maybe the Second International could measure the strength of the proletariat by how many parliamentary votes it got. And so Bernie Sanders, as being a socialist, us campaigning for him can be help us show like the measure of the strength of the proletariat. And actually that's kind of like the sickness of it, is kind of using, again, even though the Second International kind of like collapsed into reformism, whatever, it was still very ostensibly Marxist. and very concerned with the political independence of the working class, which Bernie Sanders is not, right? The Democratic Party is not. So using Kautsky as a way to justify like door knocking for Bernie Sanders is the kind of thing that Platypus would be interested in recognizing, right, as what we'd call an ideological obstacle, right? And actually this trend still persists. And again, it's a lot to cover. I don't want it to muddy the waters too bit. But you can actually trace how this like, what we call neo-Kautskian moment in the 2010s actually is still persists in the Social Democrats of your party, right? Or the Revolutionary Communist Organization in Australia. Or there's also one in the Netherlands. There's a lot of currently existing, much younger parties who are trying to kind of establish a kind of like mass party base, right? On the other hand, the term Kautskianism has kind of dropped from the vocabulary. And that in itself is also very interesting. And I could kind of go on about that as well. But yeah, so that's what Kautsky...
Very briefly, who was Karl Kautsky?
That's a great question. So Karl Kautsky was the head theoretician of the German Social Democratic Party. He was known as the Pope of Marxism. He wasn't like an official representative of the German Democratic Party, but he was seen as kind of like the most, the more radical Marxist, kind of like intellectual clarification of what the party was going was directing in. So he had this kind of notion of these writings of like, okay, how is the Social Democratic Party of Germany, or like, you know, how would one conduct a kind of like socialist movement, transformation of society through political organization, and through kind of like, I want to say like, not quite democratic, because that's in the foundations of the German Social Democratic Party, they were kind of made illegal. You had like these anti-socialist laws, and so it actually wasn't possible for them to conduct any political activity. But then later, they started campaigning or like putting forward representatives to the Reichstag. And so one of the things that emerged from that was like, okay, well maybe we can use this kind of ostensibly parliamentarian part of the party to measure and to agitate the workers, kind of like the worker strength. But I think at its core, I'd say maybe one of the importances, and actually the way that Luxemburg describes the purpose of this kind of mass party is to provide a kind of organization that can give the proletariat a kind of experience of running society, right? So it can experience wins and defeats, but also it can also, this term of state within a state refers to the fact that they organize a lot of like actual social functions, right? So they organize like women's groups, children's groups, choirs, like the list kind of like goes on. But that part of the purpose of the party was to actually socialize the proletariat at a time when actually they might be kind of like, they're simultaneously like really embedded into society, but also really alienated from social life or political life. It's not a great explanation, but I think that's the idea of like the mass socialist party with a combination of like Marxist intellectuals and trade unions working with each other towards socialist transformation. And that then has had a recent afterlife in the last like 10, 15 years. That actually falls kind of below what that is, or has been used kind of as a cover.
I mean, the kind of way that he disavowed the Russian Revolution is probably it's quite useful for a social democratic party today, or like a socialist party.
Yes.
They can kind of draw away from that and say, okay, we want to look at Kautsky for his mass politics, but recognizing that he was foresighted enough or something to not want to support the Bolsheviks. Have you sort of noticed that as a quite impressive, like a factor in how it's been taken up? I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. So the way that Mike McNair uses Kautsky, or his like return to the Second International, and this idea of kind of like the patient building up of the mass party, was as a way to get over the problem of Marxist sectarianism, which kind of became more of an apparent problem or object in the anti-war movement. So the anti-war movement saw, it's like a great time of activity for the left, and it was kind of the first. You guys can correct me on this, but the first time since the fall of the Soviet Union that you had these like older Marxist parties actually come back into the public light and start to recruit young people. But for again, it's kind of a long story to get into. But there were several like scandals, collapses, this feeling of retreat after or downturn after the anti-war movement. And so Mike McNair kind of sees kind of two phenomena that are kind of emblematic of this. So one of them is what he calls sectarianism, particularly with people who are like Leninists. So this could be like Trotskyists, it could be communist parties, who kind of have like a strong ideological purity to them. Again, you guys can correct me if I'm kind of paraphrasing here. And then on the other side, these kind of like left unity projects, where it's kind of like a lesser of all evils. Let's try to like overcome this like sectarianism. And he says actually this needs a kind of theory of political organization for workers. But I think as part of, I think definitely what Kautsky is doing there is a way of kind of jumping over like the rotten Leninism, both in terms of like the sectarian politics of the time, like through organizations like the SWP or Socialist Workers' Party. You guys have probably seen them around, the RCP, but also of, as you said, I was actually talking about this with Ephraim earlier, that maybe McNair is trying to see the upside of the collapse of the Soviet Union, in that it's like, okay, maybe the Russian Revolution has been proved wrong, but maybe we can still get something redeemable from the precursor, and maybe we do have to kind of go like reach our arm background and recover Kautsky and Lenin's relationship to Kautsky. How are you guys doing for this? So this is a bit more of a niche conversation, but, and I kind of want to give you guys the chance to ask some questions.
Well, my kind of general, if I were going to try and my general understanding is like it's about finding a theory that helps us progress with the left or move forward with the left without kind of being tainted by capitalism, or tainted or being kind of obscured by, it's like, how do we have a mass party in a capitalist system and it not fail, basically. And like Kautsky is someone who's gone close to that, I guess.
Yeah.
Correct me.
No, I don't know.
Yeah.
So you said that you've maybe heard about Kautsky before, just like as someone who's been on the left.
Yeah, but it's not something I could like. I could speak about exactly with the nuances of the theory. But I guess it's like, but the conversation more generally is like he's come up recently because of disillusionment, and it's like with the whole point of Platypus is like you're searching for theory that helps us progress, or helps us that we can put into practice.
Kind of. I think, and a lot of the ways that Platypus, like we as members, kind of describe our project is as negative project, right? So it's not so much trying to provide a theory, because also actually even providing capital T theory requires an actual political movement, right? And what we understand, and I think like in our historical moment, like political theory, like the political theory of Kautsky becomes a kind of like set of rules. But I think what Platypus maybe would more try to do is kind of help one recognize the absence, the kind of actually what did these thinkers achieve, because it's actually a lot more sophisticated and a lot more serious than a kind of typical engagement with someone like Kautsky or Leonard or Luxemburg actually kind of describes. Like the stakes were a lot higher. And actually that helps us feel the kind of chasm and absence of like the left between our moment and the past. Because again, it's like maybe the left that could emerge in the future would be completely unrecognizable, right? That's also part of why our symbol is the platypus. Because when Engels first read about, Friedrich Engels first read about the platypus, he thought it was fake. He's like, there's no way that natural history could produce something like the platypus. So when he saw one in like London Zoo, he was like, oh my God, like history can produce these like really strange things. So part of Platypus's like ethos is that maybe a living left would be unrecognizable and maybe very, very different from Lenin, Luxemburg, Kautsky. But I think for me the main lesson, or like let's say lessons, or like what's most interesting about the writing around that period is that through creating the Social Democratic Party, you're not escaping capitalism, but you're actually you're kind of like objectifying capitalism and it's like within the party itself, and then it generates these like moments of like theoretical or political crisis that actually points to maybe a political opportunity to actually change the world. And even that, and also that like, and you kind of get this with like Lenin's Imperialism pamphlet, that the organization of socialism worldwide at that time does have a relationship to the phenomena of like imperialism, right? And that actually it's precisely that connection between like socialism and capitalism that can be exploited. Yeah, but it's I think this aspect of negativity is really kind of like key to Platypus, because I think it can also be seen that we're trying to give you like a better theory, but it's actually just kind of to point back of like, okay, this is how these are the most interesting attempts to really think about the historical task of the left of producing a kind of like free society, and the kind of most interesting ways to conceptualize like how you can jump from like one kind of society to the next, right? And actually like what's interesting with Marxism is that it sees socialism as a product of capitalism, and that there's a kind of, that's kind of where the potential is. So it's getting a bit vague for on my part, but that's helpful.
Sure, question.
You pretty much answered the question. I was going to ask a very similar question, like what socialism and Marxism would look like today. Like, could it be possible? And would it be? Well, I don't know. It's the same question, pretty much.
Yeah, actually, that does kind of remind me. I think what we're trying to do also is to help you feel, especially if you're coming from like a left background. I mean, in Platypus we attract all kinds of people, so some people will have history of being in the left, some people won't, and are just kind of coming into it like fresh and really not having a political education. And I think what we want to do is kind of help you feel like you don't have to have these like taboos of like what political position you should have, what line you should uphold, because all bets are off. And that actually understanding this history, how it kind of like comes back into the way that the left talks in the present or acts in the present can help you realize that actually you don't need to do that. And maybe there are possibilities for more creative types of action that can reconstruct what we call a Marxian left. Maybe it wouldn't even be a Marxian left, but it would be Marxian in the sense that it would be critically and historically aware of itself. But yeah, that's kind of like the end product of Platypus, is to make you guys have like a what the fuck moment. When hopefully Tony puts on a panel in a couple of years' time where we have like an anarchist, a Maoist, and like a social democrat on the stage, and they're all like simultaneously agreeing with each other and disagreeing with each other, but on like all these different historical points. It's kind of like, what the fuck is happening here? Like, how did we, and again, it's kind of like, actually, you don't have to have a line on like national self-determination, for example, to like be on the left, right? Or of like, that socialists should participate in like bourgeois government or not, right? That's kind of like up for the taking.
What would you say, like what are other examples for ideological obstacles, and how would you say, how is it possible to identify them? Because apparently it's not so easy to be aware of them, and how do you know if it's an obstacle or not?
That's a great question. So the way I would start answering, so Platypus has three, we have this term called the tripod. It's kind of how our organization works. So one leg of the tripod is your hosting the conversation on the left. So those are your panels, the Platypus review over here, the reading group. So that's kind of engaging with these like classical texts of Marxism, which is kind of simultaneously supposed to give you a specific theory of history that Platypus has. So we do have a narrative of like, okay, what are like the high points and low points of the history of Marxism, right? What's the most interesting? But the reading group is also informed by texts that the left reads, right? So if you talk to someone from like the Socialist Workers' Party, they will have read the Transitional Program by Leon Trotsky, right? So identifying the ideological obstacles is kind of having, like the reading group is like learning the language of the left and learning the history. And at least this is in my experience, the ideological obstacle is when the history of the left becomes a set of like rules or positions that are raised in the present to actually not think through to not think through actual defeats in the left. So I think one thing that we want to get across is that the left is dead. Not in terms of like, obviously the left, there's a kind of like zombie left, which also includes ourselves, it includes Platypus. But there is no like workers' movement for socialism, right? There is no workers' movement for socialism. Especially when compared to like the Second International era. And so it's like, okay, on the one hand, the ideological obstacle is a way to kind of like hold on, is like the readoption of history as a way to like find an immediate position in the present in a way that actually maybe prevents creative political thinking or actual like critical thinking. But it's also a way for the left to kind of think it's still alive. So I remember, again, I'm using the SWP as like all my examples, but it's because I've been to a lot of their events. But I remember going to an event where they were talking about the Arab Spring. And they said, we supported I'm going to completely misquote them, but I think the idea was that they were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood against the Arab Spring. No, I'm going to botch it. Yeah.
They did support the Muslim Brotherhood
Yeah.
in Egypt, and they
Against-
thought it would be some kind of like, obviously against the previous regime
Yeah.
Of Mubarak, Hosni Mubarak, and they thought that it would kind of lead to revolutionary opportunities, but they ended up kind of obviously getting used by the Muslim Brotherhood and liquidating their politics into that alliance, and then it obviously ended in disaster for the Muslim Brotherhood with a military coup.
Yeah, and the way they justified that move was through an analogy with like the 1905 Russian Revolution. So they're like, oh, well, like Lenin took this position in the 1905 revolution, which is like analogous to the Arab Spring. So that's what we're going to do. And that to me would be like, okay, they're kind of using history in this way to justify their support for I think that is just very, very different from something like the 1905 Russian Revolution. And so then I would kind of go about, and kind of my job then as like a Platypus member would be to kind of like raise this as like, oh, hey, you're kind of like using Lenin as a way to justify like non-Marxist politics in the present, right? Because there is no like mass workers movement in Egypt. There is no mass workers movement globally or in Europe that would make something like the support or the critical support for the Muslim Brotherhood meaningful, politically meaningful in another way. So that's kind of a way of starting to get at it. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, a bit, but I'm still thinking how would you see that, for example, that would be an abuse of his history, and because they probably would have another explanation. So who puts like from which standing point from are you like measuring like if it's an obstacle or not? That's what I'm not sure of.
Yeah.
Like it seems as if there was like an objective point from which on you could like look through all the cases and then say, okay, that's an obstacle, that's not, but they thought so, but how can you like identify that this one is an obstacle?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, for me in that moment, and again, this is just kind of like a case study. It was first like through the reading group, for example, kind of knowing the history of like what are Trotsky's writings on this, Lenin's writings on this, Luxemburg, understanding the overall context of like they're not just writing as like political leaders of the like Bolsheviks, but actually political leaders in a international, like a very like real political reality of international socialist workers' politics, which is just very different from something like the Arab Spring, where you don't have a socialist organized international, and again, you wouldn't really need like a Marxist conception of like the Arab Spring to take that position, like either way. Whereas with like Lenin and a certain kind of like critical perspective towards the political movements of his time, you do kind of need Marxism to have a feeling of like, okay, like we have this like socialist movement, it has this kind of reverse character of capitalism, and this is how I'm going to try to politically clarify a line that would strengthen the socialist movement. So that's, yeah, I don't know, that's one way where I'm kind of like, okay, there's something wrong about the analogy of these two situations. And by transplanting Lenin into like 2025 or 2024, whenever I saw the thing, you're actually falsifying the history. And also you're kind of like, because you're saying, this is the stance that Lenin took, this is the stance we have today, you're actually preventing people from actually critically engaging with a failed revolution, which is what the Arab Spring was, right? And to be like, okay, well, we'll just take the same position and that's the end of that. We'd say, actually, no. There's something maybe a bit more interesting here. Or maybe for Platypus it'd be like, well, there actually is an absence of the left. And maybe that's, in our current time, that's the most meaningful lesson that we can learn from these political events. is actually it should be meaningful. It should be politically meaningful, but it's not, right?
So I was kind of being touched on like vaguely a couple of times, but I was kind of wondering why you guys as a group believe that there is like a lack of the radical left in today's world, especially in the rise of like right-wing extremism across the world, and especially with like the modern rise of AI power, which like is known to have like a potential impending future of control. I'm confused why people aren't as like radicalized into this like more left nature. And then so I was wondering like what like do you think that if you keep saying that the left is dead, there should be like a rebranding or an image change in the way that like you're talking about people still looking at Marx and trying to copy his moves from 100 years ago. Like there's clearly obvious issues or errors by trying to deify the works of someone who was flawed as well. So it's like how do you rebrand? But then you also mentioned earlier about like forgetting history, you just repeat mistakes again. So how do you actually learn and improve? So I feel like I feel like there's just too much of a misconception or negative connotations surrounding like the left nowadays, just as a result of the Cold War and other obvious issues. But then it's like how do you get people back inside? It's like I don't know what are people thinking is the move? If you're talking about right now, like there's not a whole lot going on.
No, I mean, and it's not my job to tell you what the move is.
But yeah.
But I think what we're, as a educational group, that is like very concerned with a kind of critical, kind of like critical evaluation of the left. I think I'll put it this way. So from Platypus's perspective, which is very informed by like the history of Marxism, the living left, capitalism, or like the subject of history within capitalism is like the proletariat, right? Working people, and again, like a lot has changed since Marx's time. And again, there should be a possibility to kind of rethink this, but I think like when we talk about revolutionary Marxism in the beginning of the 20th century, is to take stock of like what Marxism and socialism really meant, not just as like an idea, but as an actual political force movement that was coordinated internationally. Maybe another way of putting it is that you don't necessarily need Marxism to oppose the far right. Like you can do that as a liberal. I think in terms of like the current left, why I would call it something like a zombie left, right? That's more of like my own expression, is that there actually is no mass movement, like workers' movement, proletarian movement behind it, or its politics isn't informed by conception of like the political role of an organized working class to change capitalism. But it is like with AI, for example, it's a shame that there isn't a kind of workers' movement to actually register how that impacts workers and how they might be able to reassert, or not even just reassert their right against, unemployment. Because actually maybe the point being like, actually, maybe AI could be the greatest thing that ever happened, in the way that like the steam engine could be the greatest thing that ever happened, but actually created more work and more drudgery. And actually a socialist movement wouldn't just be in opposition to capitalism, but would be able to kind of grasp onto like what is its transformative capabilities, and how would we strategically kind of work through its social effects. And I don't know. I just don't think that's on the left. But again, it's not like I'm just kind of posing the question of.
No, because I kind of think one of the things I seem to worry about with AI, especially that the future might hold with it, is that the security functions that could be applied with AI would allow such like a level of, I don't know, control that could kind of consolidate kind of any future regime. Like
Maybe. I mean,
rigidity.
maybe at that point.
Then it's like, surely now, like if we're before that time, surely now's the time to like start to like, I don't know, question what's up
Yeah, like-
right now.
Your question, I guess you're kind of getting to like where's the socialist consciousness that would be adequate to that? Is that sort of what you mean? Or just the left in general?
Especially when it seems like there was such a over 100 years ago there was actual like I don't know, extremism. People were like wanting to take action and stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
But like I feel like people just aren't that invested anymore. And especially the working class or worker like seem to be more, I don't know, exploited by the right wing at the moment, especially. So it's like, why are people not filling that void? Like I know we've got the rise of the Green Party in the UK now, but then I know that's extreme for like a UK politics like perspective, but then it's like it only seems like it's only filling that void against reform.
It does go to what you said about rebranding, right? So the Green Party seems like a rebrand rather than a rethink.
Yeah.
And I think people can feel that that's sort of in some way shallow or short term.
That's what it
with
kind of feels like.
respect.
I don't know. It doesn't seem like they have like I feel like people are quite critical of reform outside of like the right wing bubble for being like not a very serious party. But then I feel like people are also quite critical of the Green Party being that in the same way, where it's like people don't really know how seriously they'd stand or how effective they'd actually be if they were in like I don't know what they'd really get up to if they were actually in control.
One of the sort of peculiar things about Platypus, to go to your question about why aren't people politically motivated, why isn't there a left that seems capable of addressing like major social crises that are obviously, you know, shifting and transforming as we speak, is that there's a kind of common historical narrative about how we got here, which changes over time, but it's something like nasty right-wing politicians like smashed the left, and they used their newspapers to like trick the working class into voting for them, and sometimes that things like consumerism distract people from being able to like engage in a better form of politics or pursue a better world, or that you know, there's all kinds of stuff that sort of explain that, but it seems like the history of the present is a right-wing history in which the way that the present was created by a series of historical developments is a function of the activity of the right, let's say. And obviously I'm assuming the terms left and right here, and part point of Platypus is to put that into question, but let's just assume it for now. Platypus's gambit is to kind of flip that, and Rebecca mentioned this phrase, a left-centric view of history, which is to say that in a kind of underground way, the most important determining factors of the present are the failures of the left. And so to really think about the way in which the present is a product of history and not just some kind of like slab of randomness, you actually have to understand not only the history of the left, but you have to understand it as a history of defeats. So most like left groups, if you go to their meetings, they'll narrate to you an account of history of a kind of just so story of we fought really hard and we didn't quite make it that time, but the struggle continues and we'll try again. And there isn't really any processing of the fact of the defeat of the left. It's kind of like brushed aside, and then all the blame is put on, oh, like Thatcher smashed the unions and neoliberalism made everyone isolated and greedy and all this kind of stuff. And Platypus is trying to say the left needs to take responsibility for its own role in this history, which was a series of defeats that it failed to learn from and failed to recognise.
Why do you think the left is so defeatist in their outlook on their own history then? Or it's big, almost like, I don't know, it's kind of almost immature to not accept that your own like failings.
It's a kind of immaturity, yeah. It's a function of those ideological obstacles. It's the baggage of history that kind of weighs on us in the present. And I think it's kind of has an esoteric quality to it as a thought to think this way, but to recognise that both the kind of apathy that you would like generally see around you, but then also because the flip side of the apathy is this like manic activism, where people are like, oh my god, we have to do something right now, and it doesn't matter what the consequences are, we'll just like do a protest, and who cares if it's going to go nowhere, we have to do something right now. Or we'll all get arrested, and it's like, okay, but then after that, what are you going to do? It's like, don't ask that question, just we'll all get arrested, that will change something. And that kind of manic actionism is the flip side of the apathy. And what Platypus is trying to get people to see is like, okay, let's look at what's happening here and see how there's a kind of psychological, historical baggage that's causing this kind of weird split personality kind of thing. So obviously Platypus as a project and activity by itself is not adequate to reconstituting a new left. Obviously that involves politics, that involves organising people, that involves coming up with new creative ways of doing things. But Platypus is this kind of negative ideological project of trying to clear away some of that historical baggage to free up the space in which a new generation might like be able to process things in a healthier way. In that sense, there's a kind of psychoanalytic metaphor to what we're doing.
Therapizing.
It's kind of like there's a therapizing act. It's because you want to be able to become an active person in the world again, right? And to have a better reality principle. I mean, what you confront with the left most commonly is a kind of their lack of a grasp on reality, right? They're always saying like fascism is around the corner, and then it's like, no, not quite. Like, I know you're thinking of something, there's something happening, but you're giving this kind of like slightly deluded, and I think like normal working class people can see that, like the common perception of the left is crazy people, right? And there's something to that. But we kind of have this reverse move where we're like, okay, what if we take that really seriously and think about why is that the case and how could that be overcome? I wanted to raise a question on a slightly like related but different topic, which is about democracy.
Yeah.
Because you kind of kept touching on democracy and dictatorship. There was that opposition.
Mm-hmm.
There was also the opposition of the state and society.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about like what would it mean to produce a free society? There's also the state like controlling people in a way. There's like the armed special bodies of armed men, right? I think this goes to the AI question of like that there's a technology that could like massively upgrade the capacity of society, and on the other hand what we immediately realize is that it's potentially used for like social control by the state. And so yeah, maybe you could just sort of address some of those questions. There's like because I think people want the left to be democratic.
Yeah.
Part of one of the ideological obstacles around Marxism is that it necessarily produces a dictatorship.
Yeah.
I mean, this goes to the issue of the political party, which maybe we shouldn't take for granted as much as we maybe have in this discussion. And we should entertain, for example, the anarchist critique of the party, going back to the First International, which is that Marxism attempts to kind of mediate politics through a political party is inevitably going to lead to the dictatorship of a minority over the majority, and it's inevitably going to lead to a state form of politics rather than freeing society from politics. And so in the history of the left, we shouldn't kind of assume that political party function. It's kind of always been the object of a criticism around the issue of like democracy in the state. Like, it seems like in capitalism, to be political, you have to have a party. Parties are democratic, but they're also the way in which democracy becomes a form of control. You have like one-party states, but then where you have multi-party systems, it all just seems like a sham. Then there's a question of like democracy within the party versus like centralized, like the party as a control mechanism. So all of that was kind of, I think, the question about not a political movement that wouldn't get tainted by capitalism. I'm not sure what that could mean many different things, but one way people think about that is that, you know, one of the things, you know, people thought they learned from the failure of Marxism was that a political party makes you tainted by capitalism. Right, because political parties are part of the capitalist system. And on the other hand, it gets to this question of like AI, where it's about you know, in the kind of the way that AI in the present is generating a kind of reboot of old dystopian imaginations. You obviously get a kind of 1984 vision of Big Brother's eye watching you, and it's controlled by the party, right? And it's that kind of issue. So just sort of, that's a lot about trying to tie together some of those issues that have come out.
I'm trying to think of how to begin. I guess where I start. Okay, maybe we can get into a bit of Platypus is like almost a historical point of departure with the left, which doesn't start with Marxism.
Right.
So like I think the earliest person that we read, no, I think it's Rousseau, but we start, you know, before
Mandeville.
Oh, we read Mandeville. Yeah. So he's really early. Bernard Mandeville, Fable of the Bees. Private vice makes public virtue. So we start. So before getting onto Marx, we want to kind of get an idea of the like left tradition that Marx is in, which can be described in a lot of different ways. So it can be like the bourgeois revolutions, the Enlightenment, liberalism. But I think like what Marx can take for granted is a certain assumption of a kind of like not rationalizing, but a kind of modern, progressive, rational society. At least in the writings of people like Rousseau, Bernard Mandeville, Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, and even like Benjamin Constant, who talks about the liberty of the ancients versus the liberty of the moderns, referring specifically to democracy and voting rights. And Constant, I mean, he's writing this in like the 1820s, 1830s, forget the exact date.
19.
Yeah. So his point, and which encapsulates this general feeling of like social versus political participation in modern society, is that actually maybe as opposed to ancient Greek democracy, where the democratic participation of its citizens could actually violate the individual life of another. Like you could vote to exile someone, or you could vote to kill someone. The kind of like modern concept of liberty is an engagement between the individual and society as like, I don't want to say the same thing necessarily, but that society actually starts to reproduce itself and life outside of political mandates, right? And that actually, it's through individual desire that society starts to kind of reproduce itself and have a market. Again, I'm kind of like really vulgarizing everything, and I'll try to connect it to democracy. But I think in things like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, whilst there was an emphasis, like, you did have these ideas of like political participation, what was new was the idea that actually maybe politics would become increasingly unnecessary as society regulates itself, right? And what Marx writes about and realizes in his kind of moment of like the first big collapse of industrial capitalism is that actually this kind of like free-flowing, self-regulating society kind of like meets its edges with industrial capitalism. That I talked about these like two different rights of private property, the right to sell your labor, the right to buy labor, kind of like become opposed. And that the modern state, which he calls like a Bonapartist state, but you can just call it like the modern capitalist state, kind of has this role above society of like making sure it doesn't collapse. Maybe that's a good way of kind of maintaining some form of social order through, through consolidating conflict between like these different rackets. And by rackets, it's like interest groups. And one of the ways it does that is through democratic participation. So the demand for democracy during the Enlightenment being a kind of like universal demand for participate in society becomes a kind of like function of how the state may or may not run society to avoid collapse, right? But I think what's interesting is that the left, like even from Marx's time, kind of with the Republican revolutions, but you get this a lot in like especially now, like with the Kautsky is like social democracy, and you've probably heard like Republican socialism is like being a trend maybe among slightly older leftists now, but it's within this branch of like
Republic.
Yeah, the Party Republic, right? Party Republic. Okay.
In your party, then that's one of their trends, isn't it?
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Max Shanley and that.
Okay, so through your party, democracy becomes really, like, as opposed to a symptom of capitalism, becomes like reified as what will get you beyond capitalism. And I think like there is a part of, or not part, but like part of the vision of like socialism, communism is simultaneously like, you've heard this word sublate? So it means it's from Hegel. So it's like the simultaneous destruction and realization of something. So in socialism, communism, it's like simultaneously destroys the basis for like bourgeois society, liberal society, whilst also realizing its like initial utopia, which is a kind of rationally organized, self-governing society. And I think part of with the political party in the Second International, and what just struck me when like reading back over like Luxemburg and Kautsky, was that they feel that the party is mostly necessary to give its workers a kind of experience of participating and running society for themselves. So like Marx's whole theory of like the transition to socialism and the transition from socialism to communism is that there would be a period where the proletariat movement, party, whatever, would take control of the state and use it towards, not use it towards its own aims, but like would kind of have a position of like dictatorial power, which it would then use to actually dismantle like the way that society kind of reproduces itself through relations of private property. I know that's like super abstract, but maybe where the Marxists and the anarchists agreed was the eventual dismantling of the state, right? And it was just the means of like how to get there. So the anarchists would say actually, like maybe politics is a sham, and this kind of doing democracy within the realm of the state is a sham, and that actually you need a kind of like self-liberation. That you can be like, I don't know, maybe my anarchism's a bit rusty, but that you can kind of like realize the world that you want now through direct participation in society, and that you just need to kind of like will it to be. Whereas kind of like a Marxist theory of society sees that like there are these kind of like almost unconscious forces where, or maybe not unconscious, but kind of like there's the powerful force of the state. But it can't just be simply like avoided, but actually needs to be like worked through, right? I really have to pee, so I'm gonna, I'm really sorry about that, but I wonder if...
Who's with the next question or contribution?
I was going to say, just about like the, I don't know, the breakdown of the state. Do you think that it's in a globalized world that needs to happen across the globe all at once for the state to be broken down? Because otherwise, do you not think it would be like you cause like a Cold War-esque like fracture, and then like a long drawn out warfare of forcing the other side to pick up the same view?
Or a hot war?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean,
That's what I'm
just
saying.
stop
Like an
it.
actual like worldwide warfare of like we have to go one way or another.
I mean, that's part of the, obviously the crisis of the, why Marxism failed, was that its vision was a world revolution in which the working class would take control in, at least in the major capitalist countries of Britain, France, Germany, the US, and sort of then gradually lead the whole world to socialism, and that there would then be no state, like there would be an international system, and that's a vision that's existed from what Rebecca was talking about, from the Enlightenment, right? There's one of the essays we read by Kant, the idea for a universal history from a cosmopolitan standpoint, talks about working out the problem of like a global system of perpetual harmony to be like the midway point in human progress. Right, we're not even anywhere kind of near that, but obviously the Russian Revolution got isolated, the German Revolution failed, there was never a revolution in England, which would have been like essential as then the sort of global hegemon at the time with the British Empire. And so it became this thing called socialism in one country, which was a betrayal of the whole vision. And so now it seems like total utopianism to believe that, you know, part of what happened from that is that the old Enlightenment liberal vision of cosmopolitan international society kind of disappeared, and you got a resurgence of nationalism, right? And the nation state became the organizing principle of the world. So even when you had something like the United Nations, it was really built around the existence of strong nation states. And so now it seems like utopianism to believe that that would be possible to actually overcome the state on a global basis. But that was the goal of these late 19th century, early 20th century socialists, and we're kind of posing the question of, isn't that still what's necessary? And how do we deal with the fact that the whole question of internationalism now has just become a question of solidarity with some people in a war somewhere, and not the question of like taking power globally without throwing the whole world into a like death spiral civil war.
So also I was going to say, do you think then for a, I don't know, global revolution to happen, it would have to start from a country that had like, I don't know, profound impacts on the rest of the world if they like, if China can control like 90% of rare elements, or some country like that who's a major producer that everyone has to be dominant on.
It starts with an A.
Starts with someone else and then like snowballs out.
Yeah, like America.
Yeah, like America.
I mean, that's one of the primary issues, right? Is that the left is anti-American, and yet, obviously, if there's going to be a world revolution, it has to happen in America. Where it has to go through America.
Undemocratic. It's quite anti-democratic in that way, would you say? In terms of like where the basis of world revolution might emerge.
I'm not sure if that's about.
China or
Well, it depends what you mean by democracy. Obviously, then you get into like population numbers, and then you'd be like, well, yeah, India and China.
Right.
Obviously, those would be very important countries, and there are massive working classes there that you would want to organise, and you would want to have something like an international, in which the global working class, organised into parties in their own countries, agrees on a common international programme. And that's what's so crazy about the First World War, is that the working class had formed an international organisation across pretty much the whole world, in which it agreed, if the governments try to start a war, we will refuse, and we will start a revolution to take over our own governments against their war. And then when it came down to it, they went out and killed each other. Like, the working class went out to shoot their fellow workers in the battlefields, and that fundamental like problem is the one that like ultimately it does sort of come back to. But it is important to, I think a lot of the time what happens with the left is that people want to gain traction. They realise they're isolated. They want to gain traction by being realistic, even if they're still sounding radical. And so they don't raise questions like the one you just raised, which is like, oh wait, but wouldn't this require simultaneous revolution in multiple countries, especially America, without descending into global war? And then they're like, oh no, we can't, that's a taboo, actually. We can't deal with that. Let's just do this small thing.
Which you don't need Marxism for, right? I mean, I think, at least in my experience of, or kind of like one of the things I've taken out of the last couple of years, is that a lot of these, the lowered horizons beyond that like utopian vision actually doesn't require the history of Marxism. And that maybe it would be best if the Socialist Workers' Party became a radical liberal party. Sorry for interrupting.
No.
But I think it's nice to have the stakes, and again, the history is a good marker of like when taken to a really like, and when people took it very, very seriously and were actually making headway towards an actual utopian, like it felt real, right? That you could actually transform capitalism on the global scale into socialism. And anything below that doesn't really need Marxism. And maybe one would be better off discarding it.
I mean, the way you put it earlier was the mass socialist parties of the Second International objectified capitalism within themselves in some sort of image of capitalism, and so it was able to present those questions
To itself.
more clearly to itself. Whereas now you'd struggle to
Yeah, it's
objectify
like,
things in the same way.
like, what is the working class? What does that, like, what does that even mean? Like, and that would be, you would have to kind of have a theory of like, what is capitalism now? How is it continuous or discontinuous from capitalism of like 200 years ago? And kind of like, what would an organization need to do to actually work through the way that capitalism produces for its like a way out of capitalism? And that requires like again, it's like quite a serious level of organization and thinking and reflecting that even the parties of the Second International struggled to do, right?
That kind of objectification, is there a parallel to the way Platypus is trying to objectify the left? Or is there a different question at play?
That's a good question. I think, because I'm not sure about this myself. I don't know if you, like, any of you guys have an opinion on this, but in my head, I think it's still kind of answerable. We can start to say like, okay, maybe we can't know really what capitalism is, or like how it's kind of reproducing opportunities for its own dismantling, but we can kind of see in the negative what, at least to an extent, how the left is trying to think against it, and maybe we can learn something about capitalism through how it manifests itself in the left. And actually tracking, so a lot of what Platypus does is like track how the left changes throughout our present and our history. And you can kind of see how the left is very reactive to capitalism, again, without really making any attempts to like work through it in a kind of substantive way.
Tails.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, and it reproduces capitalism, right? So in the 20th century, you had social democracy, which wasn't the social democracy of the Second International, but there was a kind of sense of like, okay, the workers need some kind of like leverage and say within
A New Deal.
Yeah, like the New Deal. The New Deal, or like post-World War II Reconstruction, Keynesianism, is a way that the left reproduced capitalism, right? Through kind of lowering the horizon from transformation to getting a better deal for the workers, right? And you don't need Marxism for that. You could still be a leftist in some way, but I think, again, with Marx, what he does really interestingly is point like, okay, what would the left to its like fullest extent become? And it is the overcoming of the crisis of bourgeois society, of liberal society, right?
Do you think that's like a more realistic compromise for people, or do you think that's defeatist mentality, like you were talking about earlier?
What, like the getting a better deal
As
for
in,
the
like,
workers?
Yeah, as in like what you're saying in that form of reproducing capitalism, but choosing to get a better deal for the workers. I'm saying that, do you think that's like more realistic as a compromise, as like something to go into the world, instead of like, I don't know, aiming to be ambitious for extreme like ideology, you know?
Yeah, it's realistic insofar as that you don't have to change the way the world works that much. I think what, again, kind of like a core idea in like Marxist theory, and something that's returned to by like the orthodox Marxists of the Second International, so that's Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Kautsky, is that capitalism does produce crisis. So even though you might have an era where the workers have a better deal, and again, better deal is also like, you would still have the sense that actually the deal could be better if we didn't have capitalism. But my point being, that better deal can be taken away as quickly as it's given, right? If workers aren't actually in charge, or if society isn't in charge of itself. But again, maybe like I think a lot of people would be better off like mentally in their own hearts if they did just like let go of Marxism and accept the lowered horizons. But I think what's interesting to me is when there are these lowered horizons, but you use Marxism as like a tool to justify lowering your horizons, right? That's actually a problem, right? That's the kind of ideological obstacle.
We're gonna have to wrap up pretty soon.
Yeah.
So maybe just some final,
Can I ask a question?
thoughts,
Yeah.
questions. Yeah.
You know, you brought up working class movements and we're speaking about Kautsky. Is there a difference between a movement like workers' movement and the left? Like, can we like I don't know? Can you speak about that a little?
Yeah. So one of the theories, or the ongoing self-conception of the Second International, or like the German Social Democratic Party, is sort of a merger between the workers' movement, which was represented in like the trade unions, and socialist intellectuals, right? So who had these like utopian ideals and theories about the way that society works, at a kind of like higher level, but is still kind of like removed from society. And so like when Marx in like the Communist Manifesto talks about like communism per se, it's as a he kind of takes up the ongoing workers' movements, like Chartism in the UK, for example, trade union movements, or the movement for like workers' votes, like worker suffrage in the UK, as simultaneously like a symptom of like the degeneration and potential downfall of capitalism, but also the reaffirmation of capitalism. So it's like the workers aren't actually asking to like transform society, they're asking for a better deal. And in asking for a better deal, they were actually reproducing capitalism. And so there is a level. So I mean, the reference point that Platypus takes of like what is the left comes from a essay written by a Polish communist called Lech Kautsky, called On the Concept of the Left. And he wrote it during the 1960s New Left movements, right? And he goes all the way back to like the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and his formulation is that ultimately the left is the idea of utopia, right? It is like seeing what kind of, like capitalism allows us to conceive of a utopia, right? Of a certain kind of utopia that is possible, even just by the fact that we can think about it. And so that's kind of like the left. And I think like the idea, I guess with Marx trying to connect up these dots between like a utopianism and a workers' movement. Because he sees the only way to get to utopia is through a kind of like proletarian political movement or movement towards what he calls self-abolition, right? The destruction of the class itself. Rosa Luxemburg has this image of like a Golgotha path. So Golgotha is the road that Christ took on his way to crucifixion. The idea being that like the workers kind of need to end themselves in order to actually be reborn into a holier form, right? Or to actually enter into a free society. So that's how I would kind of go about thinking about that. But I think the Second International is a great way to try to think about that relationship, right? And actually, so Lukács, who we read kind of in a couple of weeks, I think, are you going to?
We're going to do it again, Standpoint of the Proletariat.
So what are you reading for the reading group?
Results and Prospects.
So Trotsky?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 1905,
Yeah.
the Russian Revolution. So in a couple, so once we kind of get past like 1917, the reading group will read George Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, which is really trying to get at this like relationship between workers and intellectuals, the subject of history and the objective conditions of history, and the kind of interaction between those two forms as a way of reflecting on the Second International.
Just to sort of go in on that final point, one of the things that Platypus tries to emphasize is that capitalism is a crisis of history, and that the forms of historical consciousness that we have under capitalism are themselves kind of pathological, right? So history not just meaning the relationship, not just meaning the past or what's happened, but the relationship that the present has to the past, and how that can appear to be pointing towards freedom, right? And that in the 19th century with capitalism, you get this kind of explosion of history in a way. History becomes a kind of concern in a new way for people, but it's a crisis of history, it's a crisis of historical meaning. And that capitalism itself creates a kind of, on the one hand, this obsession with history, right? History becomes like a collector's game of, all the facts and figures of the past, and in that sense it kind of bears down on us with this terrible weight of like all the dust of the ages. And on the other hand, you get this kind of mindless amnesia, where like every 5 years it's like nothing's happened, and you live in this sort of eternal present. And the part of the function of the party was actually to create a historical memory for the working class in its struggle for freedom. That it would not just like go through one damn thing after the next, nor would it become like drowning in the kind of facts of the past, but it would be able to mediate the fact that its own history was part of that crisis. And I think today what we either face is just a kind of historical amnesia where there's just general apathy, and this whole history is just like extremely obscure and no one really knows about it anymore. Even stuff like this might have been kind of general public consciousness.
Yeah.
People used to learn about the bourgeois revolutions in school, and now no one really does. Like the whole point of history is kind of disappearing, and people think history is just the history of racism or something, or genocide, right? And therefore it's like there's nothing to get out of it. On the other hand, you get still a kind of progressive narrative of history where like, we're always improving a little bit and progress is going on. But those, in that condition, it can seem like sometimes Platypus is we're almost trying to recover the progressive narrative of history in some way, because what's more common now is just like a historical oblivion. But I think it's really important to remember that history itself is a function of capitalism, right? And is itself a symptom of crisis. And it might be that in a free society there would be no history. We wouldn't have this kind of tortured relationship to the past that we have. And that could be like experienced both in our personal lives, right? To go back to the psychoanalytic metaphor, that you have like a tortured relationship to your own past, but at the level of the whole of society has a tortured relationship to its own history, and that would be something that we would be like freed from. And that as kind of nitty-gritty and political kind of, as the question of a political party can seem, at some level it's about dealing with that crisis of history and its relationship to freedom.
Do you think it's healthy though, like talking about a person's inner head being tortured by their past, do you think it's healthy for someone to forget about their past and not know about why they are who they are now?
Well, it's about the relationship, right? So it's about, is that past something that dominates you and inhibits you from being able to change yourself and pursue new activities and develop new relationships, or is it something that you can be freed from in a way? So it's more about just thinking like a kind of trying to take up a utopian moment of what freedom would be like, that it's not just about not having to do grinding work, it's not just about poverty, it's not just about other forms of oppression in society, but it's about actually what our whole imagination of the past and the future is in that sense, and transforming that.
We can adjourn.
Do you want to do the final word, Becca, as a teacher?
No.
I have to leave it there.
Just thank you guys for coming. Is there a nice pub around the corner or anything?
Plenty, yeah.
Plenty
if
of
anyone
pubs.
wants to hang around for a drink,
I don't know what time it
feel
is,
free.
but
I don't
yeah.
know, say for a bit to go. But yeah, that's been really good.
Yeah. Well,
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Phil.
Becca.